$1 trillion. That was the figure Donald Trump announced in November of 2025 as Saudi Arabia's intended investment in the U.S. economy over the next 4 years. The plan was described as encompassing defense contracts, artificial intelligence infrastructure, critical minerals, and broad strategic partnerships, all flowing from Riyadh to American firms. The announcement took place at a White House event during the visit of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and it was presented as the largest single bilateral investment pledge in modern American history, forming a centerpiece of the Trump administration's approach to the Middle East. Fast forward 6 months to April 29th, 2026. In an unexpected move, Mohammed bin Salman personally called Mark Carney, not Donald Trump, not the United States Trade Representative, not the Treasury Secretary. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, ruler of the world's most strategically vital oil exporting nation and custodian of the largest sovereign wealth fund with influence over U.S. political priorities, reached out to the Prime Minister of Canada, a country with just 1/10 of the U.S. population, less than 1/3 of the U.S. gross domestic product, and no formal alliance commitments to Saudi Arabia. The next day, Ottawa released an official readout confirming what Washington analysts spent 2 days trying to downplay. The call was an invitation for Mark Carney to visit Riyadh for an official state visit. During that engagement, both leaders agreed to deepen cooperation across 5 sectors: energy, critical minerals, defense, aerospace, and agri-food. The Crown Prince personally expressed gratitude to Canada for its role in safely evacuating over 300 Canadian citizens from active conflict zones during the Iran war earlier this year, where the Royal Saudi Air Force provided secure air corridors. That call, the public readout, and the record of events all point to a highly significant strategic development. The implications are far deeper than any single trade announcement. Mohammed bin Salman does not habitually place personal calls to Western heads of government without reason. He contacts Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron when European energy issues arise, Keir Starmer when British defense procurement matters, and Narendra Modi when India's energy demand creates an opportunity. Until April 29th, he had never reached out to the Canadian Prime Minister. The timing and the substance of this call, occurring against the backdrop of a public $1 trillion pledge to the U.S., were deliberate signals intended for a Washington audience. The Trump administration, the Treasury Department, the United States Trade Representative, and the National Security Council. Saudi Arabia is signaling a historic shift. For the first time in over 40 years, the kingdom no longer views the United States as its sole relevant North American economic partner. Canada is now part of this strategic calculus. The $1 trillion U.S. pledge made 6 months earlier, announced with maximum political fanfare, is being actively diluted as the Crown Prince directs strategic resources and attention toward the Canadian Prime Minister. In practical terms, the $1 trillion commitment is no longer a pure U.S. investment. It is effectively the original pledge minus whatever allocation Saudi Arabia is now directing to Canada. This reduction does not constitute a renegotiation. It is a reallocation, personally overseen by the Crown Prince through a direct call to Canada's leader rather than to the American president. Why did this pivot occur? Saudi Arabia's shift toward Canada was earned over 14 months through strategic positioning and trade, combined with a series of miscalculations by the Trump administration. The first miscalculation revolves around the $1 trillion announcement. When Trump revealed Saudi Arabia's pledge in November 2025, it was framed as a political triumph, demonstrating Saudi Arabia's selection of the United States as its preferred strategic partner. The figure was portrayed as evidence of Trump's personal influence with Mohammed bin Salman, his negotiating prowess, and the reliability of American economic leadership. However, the reality is that the operational commitments signed at the United States-Saudi Investment Forum totaled approximately $300 billion. The remaining $700 billion represented aspirational targets with no attached timeline, no enforcement mechanisms, and no identified projects. The $1 trillion figure functioned as a diplomatic ceiling, useful for messaging in both Washington and Riyadh, but not a binding operational floor. Analysts in both capitals recognized this from day one. Any Saudi capital that flows to Canada in 2026 will effectively subtract from the implied operational ceiling of the U.S. pledge. The political theater remains intact, but the money flows elsewhere. The second miscalculation centers on the Iran war. In February 2026, the U.S. and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iranian nuclear and military facilities. This triggered a regional escalation with retaliatory actions against U.S. bases in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The Pentagon has acknowledged that the cost of the conflict is approaching $25 billion. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth defended these expenditures before Congress in late April. What the Pentagon has not openly disclosed is the toll this war has taken on Saudi diplomacy. The kingdom hosts U.S. military installations and provides the spare oil capacity that stabilizes global energy prices during regional crises. Operationally, Saudi Arabia is the most critical non-NATO ally within the United States Middle East security framework. During the active phase of the Iran war, the kingdom witnessed U.S. military operations that exposed Saudi territory to potential Iranian missile strikes, all executed without prior consultation, lacking coordinated diplomatic cover, and with no compensation for the operational disruptions to commercial shipping and aviation caused by the regional escalation. This is not speculation. Multiple communications from Saudi government offices to the U.S. State Department in March of 2026 document these concerns. The kingdom formally raised its apprehensions, requested mechanisms for compensation, and in response received a public reiteration of the trillion-dollar pledge, but no tangible adjustment to the security arrangements that had left Saudi assets vulnerable during the conflict. By March 2026, Saudi Arabia realized that the trillion-dollar commitment did not guarantee the consultation rights it had assumed were intrinsic to the bilateral partnership. Meanwhile, Canada quietly evacuated 300 of its citizens from active conflict zones in Iran and surrounding regions. The Royal Saudi Air Force provided secure air corridors, and Saudi diplomatic facilities served as staging points. In operational terms, the evacuation functioned as a joint Canadian-Saudi logistics operation executed amid the most volatile regional security environment in 2 decades. That mission became the foundation for the April 29th phone call. Mark Carney received the call because the Crown Prince personally expressed gratitude to the Canadian Prime Minister for Canada's role in that operation. This acknowledgement was not ceremonial. It publicly confirmed that the operational relationship between Ottawa and Riyadh during the Iran war was deeper, more reliable, and strategically more valuable than previously suggested. While Donald Trump oversaw a conflict that strained U.S.-Saudi relations, Carney was executing an evacuation that strengthened Saudi-Canadian ties. 6 months later, that groundwork culminated in a direct call from the Crown Prince. The third miscalculation involves the Critical Minerals Partnership. In January 2026, Canada and Saudi Arabia signed a memorandum of understanding covering cooperation on critical minerals. The agreement included 5 mineral categories central to Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 strategy to diversify beyond petroleum. Canada gained access to Saudi sovereign capital, while Saudi Arabia obtained entry to Canadian extraction capacity, particularly in nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth deposits across northern Ontario, Quebec, and the Northwest Territories. The signing received little attention in Washington, with minimal coverage in U.S. political media. Neither the State Department, the Treasury Department, nor the United States Trade Representative issued a public statement. The Trump administration seemed to treat the MOU as a routine bilateral arrangement of limited strategic importance. That reading was mistaken. The January agreement laid the groundwork for the 5-sector partnership announced on April 29th. Energy, critical minerals, defense, aerospace, and agri-food. Each sector represents a channel through which Saudi sovereign capital could be deployed at scale over multi-decade horizons, targeting Canadian industrial assets that are underfunded, undeveloped, or in urgent need of foreign investment. If Saudi deployment unfolds at the scale implied by the January MOU, the combined economic impact across these 5 sectors could realistically reach the high tens of billions of dollars over the next decade, possibly more. This is not an abstract figure. The Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia manages approximately $925 billion and has a documented strategy of diversifying capital allocation to avoid over-reliance on any single Western partner. The April 29th call signals that Canada has now joined that rotation. By definition, such inclusion reduces the proportion of capital flowing to the United States. The Saudi pivot toward Canada did not occur in isolation. For 14 months, the Trump administration operated under the assumption that Canada had limited diplomatic alternatives to the U.S. Washington assumed Canadian export markets, capital markets, and security partnerships were structurally dependent on the United States, and that sustained pressure would compel Canadian concessions due to insufficient diplomatic depth. Early evidence challenged that view. The March Beijing trade deal, February's deepening of the European Union framework, a 20-partner bilateral network established in Carney's first 3 months, Shell ARC's $22 billion acquisition in April, and the Detroit Big Three filing for $2.3 billion in tariff refunds despite explicit presidential threats. The Saudi phone call on April 29th was the 6th indicator. Individually, each of these developments could be dismissed as an anomaly. Collectively, they reveal a structural pattern that the Trump administration could not accommodate. Over 14 months, Canada has constructed a global diplomatic and economic network functioning independently of the United States, expanding in real time, and now commanding the attention of a sovereign whose U.S. relationship was intended to anchor the Trump administration's Middle East strategy. Mohammed bin Salman did not place a routine call. He delivered a message. That message is clear. In 2026, Saudi Arabia is actively hedging its bilateral relationships in ways unseen in 1973, 1991, 2003, or 2023. The kingdom no longer considers the United States its sole relevant North American economic partner. At the same time, Canada has moved beyond peripheral status in Riyadh's strategic calculus. Saudi Arabia is now structurally directing its sovereign focus toward the Canadian Prime Minister, and Ottawa is reciprocating with a planned state visit to Riyadh. When it takes place, this will be the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to Saudi Arabia in more than a decade. Mohammed bin Salman will personally host the visit, which is expected to receive a maximum coverage across Saudi, Canadian, and Gulf regional media. American outlets, however, are unlikely to provide substantial reporting, as the strategic implications are beyond their current analytical scope. Yet, every major capital around the world that has been monitoring the trade tensions between Washington and Ottawa will be watching closely. Cities such as Tokyo, Seoul, Berlin, Paris, New Delhi, and Brasilia have spent the past 14 months assessing whether Canada's alignment with non-U.S. partners is merely tactical or a deeper structural shift. The April 29th phone call, followed by the planned Riyadh visit, serves as operational confirmation that this is indeed a structural realignment. This brings us to a domino sequence that has been unfolding over the past 3 weeks. Lumber was the first domino, dairy followed as the second, Alberta was the third, alcohol represented the fourth, tourism was the fifth, Lutnick's nuts moment counted as the sixth, Greer's 5 rejected demands were domino 7, the cancellation of the Columbia River Treaty fell to domino 8, Canadian licensing for medical isotopes at Darlington became domino 9, Carney's rejection of the entry fee framing was domino 10, the Wabka-Manitoba LNG corridor announcement was domino 11, the Canada Strong Fund counted as 12, the Gordie Howe Bridge standoff marked domino 13, the Federal Register bypass was domino 14, Shell ARC's $2 billion acquisition was domino 15, the Detroit Big Three's $2.3 billion refund filing was domino 16. And finally, Mohammed bin Salman's call to Mark Carney was domino 17. 17 dominoes, 14 months of sustained strategic moves. What once looked like a pattern is now the operational reality of a nation that, while Washington focused on escalation, built a global diplomatic and economic network capable of functioning independently of American cooperation. Looking ahead to the next 60 days, there are 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1, with a probability of 15%, envisions the Trump administration recognizing the Saudi pivot as a strategic warning and recalibrating its negotiation posture before July 1st. In this scenario, the CUSMA review proceeds with adjusted sectoral tariffs. Trump publicly acknowledges the Saudi-Canadian partnership as a positive development for North American economic stability. Carney's state visit to Riyadh occurs without American interference. Canadian-Saudi capital flows increase, and the U.S.-Saudi commitment is reaffirmed publicly, albeit at a reduced operational level that avoids political embarrassment. This is the optimistic path. Yet, its likelihood is limited because nothing in the Trump administration's recent posture suggests it has the institutional capacity to acknowledge that a sovereign partner, previously considered the cornerstone of Middle East strategy, has operationally hedged its relationship by personally calling the Canadian Prime Minister. Scenario 2, the most probable outcome at 55%, involves the Trump administration publicly ignoring the Saudi pivot. The CUSMA review reaches July 1st without a comprehensive agreement. Carney's state visit proceeds on its planned schedule in the second half of 2026. Saudi capital begins flowing at scale into the 5-sector partnership. Canadian critical mineral, energy, defense, aerospace, and agri-food sectors start receiving measurable Saudi investment. The trillion-dollar commitment to the United States remains on paper, but is operationally diluted. By the end of 2026, bilateral capital flows between Riyadh and Ottawa will be visible in published Saudi government documentation, while flows between Riyadh and Washington remain largely symbolic, reflecting only the announced figure. Scenario 3, with a probability of 30%, assumes an accelerated response. The Trump administration acknowledges the Saudi pivot, but reacts with public escalation instead of recalibration. Trump attacks the Crown Prince through Truth Social, while Lutnick or Greer issue public statements questioning the Saudi-Canadian partnership. The American reaction provokes an immediate counter-response from Riyadh. The trillion-dollar commitment is publicly reduced or restructured, and Saudi capital reallocates toward Canada at an accelerated pace. By year-end 2026, bilateral relations between Washington and Riyadh suffer visible damage. Capital flows from Riyadh to Ottawa surpass projections. Carney's state visit proceeds with maximum diplomatic exposure. U.S. leverage over Canada is permanently diminished. The realignment becomes irreversible. 3 potential paths, 60 days, $1 trillion pledge, 1 personal phone call from Riyadh to Ottawa, and 1 Canadian Prime Minister who, over 14 months, has built a global diplomatic network now deemed strategically valuable by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Donald Trump announced $1 trillion in Saudi commitment to the United States in November of 2025, presenting it as the centerpiece of his Middle East strategy and evidence of his personal rapport with Mohammed bin Salman. He framed it as proof that Saudi Arabia had chosen the United States as its strategic partner of choice for the coming decade. 6 months later, Mohammed bin Salman personally called Mark Carney, invited him to Riyadh, and announced a 5-sector partnership that will direct tens of billions of dollars of Saudi sovereign capital toward Canadian industrial assets over the next decade. The trillion-dollar figure remains officially recorded, yet it no longer reflects operational reality. Today, Saudi Arabia is hedging its bilateral relationships, and the country benefiting from this hedge is precisely the one Donald Trump spent 14 months attempting to economically isolate. April 29th marked the turning point. The trade war ceased to be a bilateral negotiation between Ottawa and Washington 14 months ago. It has become a global verdict on capital and diplomatic markets, determining which jurisdiction is the more competitive long-term partner. On April 29th, that verdict was rendered in a phone call from Riyadh to Ottawa. The verdict was clear: Canada. Decisions are unfolding in real time, and the next move is already on the horizon.